Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Rupert Brown, co-founder of T-, and I'm very pleased to welcome our very special guest for tonight's T- webinar. Dr. Emily Kostelnik is a clinical health psychologist and someone who lives with multiple vestibular disorders. She earned a PhD in clinical psychology and has specialized training in health psychology, which focuses on the interplay between medical and psychological illness. Health psychology also focuses on behavior change to optimize functioning and quality of life with chronic illness. Throughout her experience as a psychologist, she has worked with patients contending with many different medical conditions, such as vestibular disorders and tinnitus, but also diabetes, obesity, HIV, and addiction, to name a few, but decided to use her professional experience and personal experience as a patient to focus solely on providing education to the community of individuals living with chronic ear-related and neurological issues, to include chronic dizziness, vertigo, and tinnitus. Thus, she founded Rooted Behavioural Education to provide her behavioural health expertise to people around the world living with these concerns. Welcome, Emily. Lovely to have you here on the T- webinar. Thanks for turning up. Thank you.
Thank you, Rupert. I'm so glad to be here tonight.
I'm very especially excited because you've been helping us and you've been advising with us, and we've been really picking your brains and using your expertise to help us also along our travels to help people with tinnitus, and you've been pivotal in that role. Thank you so much. And I have the very first question for you, which is number one, how can you relate personally, Emily, to the tinnitus community?
Happy to answer. So I know many of you listening are living with tinnitus, and you hear from professionals, and it might sound like from more of an academic background, but I'm happy to share a little bit of my personal experience so you can relate and kind of see my personal experience and where I'm coming from, and really see that I can understand what you're going through and what it's like to live with these conditions. So about 4.5 years ago, I was diagnosed with a rare vestibular disorder called superior canal dehiscence syndrome, which is SCDS, and subsequently developed some other issues to include vestibular migraine, which is commonly co-occurring with SCDS. And a common symptom of SCDS, or superior canal dehiscence, is pulsatile tinnitus, which is kind of like a rushing sound where you hear your heartbeat. So I had that chronic experience for a few years prior to having a surgical repair. And then as part of the vestibular migraine picture, I do experience tinnitus. For me, is like kind of a high-pitched squealing sort of sound that I experience as part of migraine episodes. So I personally have experienced chronic tinnitus prior to a surgical repair that I had. And now my current experience with tinnitus is more around vestibular migraine, which for me is more episodic, meaning it kind of comes in episodes, discrete episodes, rather than something that I experience all the time. So I hope that can give you a little bit of background on where I'm coming from personally, and then I'm sure we'll get into some conversation about professional as well.
Absolutely, Emily. And I for one, as someone who has tinnitus and who has had it really badly, really resonates with the fact that you're a clinical practitioner, but also you have the experience, sadly, of having a condition yourself. So you really understand. And I think that's what makes it so potent, the fact that you're really able to help people in a very special way, because I think personally, from my perspective, I would understand and I would have believed you more, and that would have helped my recovery. I certainly, when I was recovering from tinnitus, the last person I found that really helped me was a woman called Penny Stannard, who was a great hearing therapist. And I think it really touched upon the fact that she also was experiencing the condition herself that made me really trust her. And I think that's really important going forward, is that obviously the clinical information is vital and it's so important, but it's the trust, isn't it? And from a personal perspective, that really helped me, and it was the final piece in the jigsaw. So I have another question for you, Emily, please. Is what would you say is the role of psychology in the management of tinnitus?
Mm-hmm. So we know that the treatment of tinnitus needs to be multifactorial. So that means we're addressing it from multiple angles and multiple specialties. And we know this is important because there can be so many causes or contributing factors to tinnitus that can range from like ear disorders, like hearing loss, for example, or a vestibular disorder, to head and neck trauma, to vascular issues, to medication side effects, to stress. So there's all these things that can contribute. And so when we think about the different treatment options for tinnitus, it might be things like addressing an underlying cause. It might be noise suppression or habituation, like sound therapy. And then counseling is usually part of that constellation. So I can really speak to the counseling piece because that's my area of expertise, which is behavioral health. So let's talk about why counseling is part of this constellation. And we know that the onset and management of tinnitus can be very alarming to people. It can have a great impact on mental health, such as causing things like anxiety and depression. And anxiety and depression can become a vicious feedback loop where the tinnitus might contribute to mood disturbance or anxiety, which in turn makes someone experience the tinnitus as more severe, which then contributes to more anxiety and depression. And so it really becomes this vicious cycle. And the cycle just continues to repeat unless we can intervene on it in some way. So from my perspective, it would be intervening on the anxiety or depression piece, which is very related to our reaction to the tinnitus itself. And prevalence estimates vary, but the best estimates I found were that individuals with tinnitus are about 1.5 to 2 times as likely to experience anxiety or depression compared with the general population. And when I say general population, I mean people living without tinnitus.
A fantastic answer. It's a great answer. I was really having this conversation with myself the other day, Emily, which was really thinking about where I was going wrong with my treatment. And a lot of the things you've just touched upon were things that really, again, made a lot of sense to me and resonated just now with what you were saying. And it suddenly occurred to me that when I was really going through my trauma, I was so focusing on the ears, which obviously that's what we're all going to do with tinnitus. It's like, it's ears, right. Everything about the ears. I'm listening for it. I'm looking at them. I'm feeling them. Everything is kind of pointing towards the thing that feels like it's of most concern. But I realized just the other day, it was only just the other day, and for me, I have to feel it. I have to really think about the information, and then finally it hits me. And I suddenly realized with the work that we were undertaking with you and beginning, and just the work that we've been looking at and what I've been looking at over the last 2 years, which is this, to coin a phrase, kind of this pre-mindfulness, this place where you have to take acceptance and self-responsibility before you're able to move on. It was like, for me, the tinnitus now, when I think about what I went through, it was all in here. Although obviously I'm hearing a ringing sound,
right?
And to all intents and purposes, I had an accident in my case, so I knew what I could attribute that tinnitus to. It was my left ear going into my right ear. But what really started to change things was the mind. So it was the psychology of the tinnitus that suddenly changed everything. If I could get that right, then everything else fell into place, which leads me on to another question that I'm dying to ask. And it's such a hot topic. It's a huge discussion topic, and it's something that comes up all the time. And I really wanted to, I'm going to move it forward because I really want you to try and explain it to me, which is, what is neuroplasticity, please?
So neuroplasticity, yes, it's a topic that comes up a lot now. It's kind of like a fancy word. It's really our brain's ability to rewire itself based on our behaviors, our experiences, and our thoughts. And one thing I see happen a lot now is various treatments or programs are sort of marketed as neuroplasticity programs. And I find that to be a bit misleading, almost in that it makes it sound like the program has some special secret or there's some special neuroplasticity intervention, when really we're engaging in neuroplasticity all the time based on how we're behaving, how we're thinking, and our experiences. And neuroplasticity can actually be negative or it can be positive. And people typically don't think of that. They usually think of only positive plasticity, like, oh, I need to learn how to change my brain. But in fact, you're engaging in negative plasticity, which basically means you're not, you're using your brain in such a way that's actually working against you. So engaging in activities like sitting online all day and Googling, how can I get rid of my tinnitus? Focusing all of your attention on your tinnitus, completely stopping your life because of your tinnitus. Because by doing those behaviors, by engaging in those thoughts, you're telling your brain, this tinnitus is so important. I better create extra neural pathways to make it even stronger. So then you're engaging these behaviors. The tinnitus is getting worse and worse. You're probably experiencing more anxiety. As that's happening, you're engaging in these negative thinking patterns. And that is neuroplasticity. It's negative plasticity because, again, it's emphasizing the tinnitus. It's probably creating a larger amygdala, which is the area of the brain associated with anxiety and fear. It's pairing tinnitus with anxiety. So when you experience a tinnitus, you're always experiencing anxiety. So that is neuroplasticity. It's negative plasticity. So let's talk about positive plasticity and the things that we can do to engage that in a more positive way. Do you have any questions so far? Was that understandable?
Yes, very much so.
Okay.
Again, as an artist and a creative, I think in visualizations, or I think of scenarios. That's what helped me. And when I think about the recovery, I was using neuroplasticity, and I didn't really realize it. That's the thing.
Mm-hmm.
Visualization for me as an artist is really, really important. That is,
Mm-hmm.
I would struggle without that positive kind of affirmation that I would give to myself. So my feeling was, when I was traipsing around at night with hyperacusis, and I could only go out at 3 o'clock in the morning just because everything else was so loud,
Mm-hmm.
I envisaged myself, the kind of thing that kept coming into me was this old Viking that would never fall down. It wasn't something that I placed there. It just kind of that was kind of my totem that I was taking into my new tinnitus kind of world. So it was really helpful, because in it, the visualization was that I felt like I would never fall down, although it would be a challenge. I felt like ultimately it wouldn't get me, and that I would overcome it. It wouldn't be something that I knew I could win, but it would be something that I would learn how to adapt to and
Mm-hmm.
work with. But I think this conversation, it's really what occurred to me. It very much reminds me of something that David Lynch talks about, and what we've just covered. I think I've had with you just the eye of the duck moment, and that's what he refers to, this place in a film where he will deliberately position some sort of thing in the film that comes together, and suddenly you get this kind of point in the film where, bam, okay, I get it. And already for me, that you've just kind of made me shiver, because I think what you're talking about now is something that is really, really important, which is exactly what you've been describing, which is the mind and the psychology, and how that so brilliantly or badly affects the idea of moving forward with the associated problems of tinnitus. Emily, it's incredible.
Exactly. So I'm glad you had an aha moment, and I hope maybe some in the audience have as well.
Yeah,
okay.
Very much so. We've had a question that's come in from America, from Boston, Massachusetts, and the question is this, Emily: any experience with FMD, fibromuscular dysplasia? Symptoms include pulsatile tinnitus, headaches, and dizziness. I'm viewing from Boston, MA, USA.
So I don't have specific experience with that diagnosis, but what I can say is that the research shows that across diagnoses, there are behavioral health interventions such as cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, as well as acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, that do well addressing most diagnoses, especially in the realm of chronic illness. And I'm happy to get into that a little bit more and kind of cover what exactly that means. One thing that I wanted to kind of rewind back to was I talked about neuroplasticity. I talked about negative plasticity and how getting stuck in the same mindset and the same behaviors can be really detrimental to our health. But I want to flip that on its head to give you all some hope as well and talk about positive plasticity and all the opportunity that we have to rewire our brain, to change our brain, because we do have 100 billion neurons. So that's a lot of opportunity for change. So positive plasticity is really engaging in things that are closer to how we want to feel. So for example, we're still living with the tinnitus, or we're still living with the headaches, or whatever it might be, but maybe we're able to do some exercise, or we're able to engage in an art project or music, for you, Rupert, like things that are still bringing us joy, because that helps our brain to de-emphasize whatever it is that's going on that we're not wanting to experience. And if we're talking specifically about neuroplasticity as it relates to more formal interventions like CBT or ACT, these have both been studied using imaging, so looking at the brain, and they both have the ability to help structurally change the brain for the better, and that in the way that we are processing emotions. But again, these are therapies that we have to engage in, we have to participate in. There's a lot of work done on the patient's part rather than something really done to us. I think there's sort of this hope in the beginning when we're diagnosed with some chronic illness, me included, that we can just show up at the doctor and there might be a pill that we can take and it will fix the situation. But unfortunately, with many chronic illnesses, that's just not the case. And so the behaviors and the thoughts that we engage in repetitively are really what helps to optimize the brain, to help de-emphasize these symptoms that we might be experiencing.
It's fantastic, absolutely fantastic. And that makes me want to kind of ask you more about the acceptance therapy. And that was something that I know we were working with you on, and we will do. Because it was that kind of thing for me. And I know I've spoken to James about it so many times. I think he hasn't got any ears left. I think I've absolutely talked to distraction, and I have to, and my partner and everybody. But it's like, what I really feel is that the mindfulness for me, I'm not saying it doesn't work for everybody, but it does work, but it didn't work initially. It would be, the only way I would equate to it would be somebody saying, would you like to do something relaxing, or go and do some yoga, or go and do something that is really cerebral and maybe a little bit physical as well. But really, that wasn't really on the cards for me. I needed to just purely and simply run. So I ran for 18 years, twice a day. And you know, a lot of people that run for a particular reason. I was running not really to run away from it, but I was running because I needed to get rid of this really crazy energy that I was possessing, because it's very when you get past the point of anxiety and, you know, you're dealing with a chronic illness, it's like you really want to try and tear yourself away from the numbness and from the kind of, it's very, very draining. By running, for me, what it would do would be give me a reset twice a day, where I was just able to come back to normal again. So what I wanted to ask you about is the idea of the acceptance therapy. So if I'm right, is that, if I'm sort of thinking about that and ask you, is that a situation whereby I'm accepting my fate and I'm sort of, in a layman's term, beginning to take self-responsibility, and then I'm able to do the things like the really amazing things like mindfulness can produce in the mind, and being able then to go and do relaxing kind of pastimes. So is that right? Could you explain more about why we would use ACT, acceptance therapy?
Sure. So I think, so acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, is like a very detailed framework, and it's a therapy that someone like myself or other mental health providers use to help people with their suffering So I'll talk first about the acceptance piece, and then I'll talk about ACT as a therapy as a whole. The way that I like to describe it to people in terms of acceptance is when we start getting into, I'm going to live like this forever, this is going to ruin my life, I'm not going to be able to do X, Y, Z. That's not acceptance. That's more catastrophizing, kind of getting in our heads. And maybe Rupert, you can relate to this in the beginning. I'm sure you had an idea in your head of all the things that you wouldn't be able to do or what your life might look like. And maybe your life looks very different from that now. Maybe there's a lot of things that you are doing that maybe you thought you wouldn't be able to. So getting into the mindset of that catastrophizing is not helpful for us. It creates more anxiety. So the way that I like to kind of marry the mindfulness piece and the acceptance piece is accepting how we feel in this moment only, and continuing to take steps to try to improve our health, because we do know that there are some things potentially that can be done for tinnitus, like addressing any root causes, like if there's vascular issues or head or neck trauma, etc., noise suppression, habituation like sound therapy, and then the mental aspect. So if we can just bring it to this moment and say, I'm only going to accept what I'm experiencing in this moment, it can be somewhat freeing, because then we're not thinking all the way about the future, about what is this going to look like in 15 years for me, because we really don't know what that's going to look like. So that's the acceptance piece. If we want to talk about ACT as a therapy, it's a much more detailed and long answer. I'm happy to go into it if you would like me to.
Yes, please. But
okay.
I would like you to, and it's exactly right what you're saying, because I think for the first 5 years, I was so young and so naive that I got through it with very little help, even from myself. I just was using tape players to create white noise, old-fashioned boogie boxes. I didn't know what was happening. I had no idea, but it was all working. So it was by luck and by experimentation as a musician. But the second time, 10 years later, that I had it really bad again, I was ill-equipped, actually. I realized that I was doing all of the negative things, exactly what you're saying. I was catastrophized. So I didn't fly, I don't think, or travel properly overseas for about 10 years because I was so unsure as to what would happen with my hearing. And, it was so difficult traveling. It was enough to be able to just get on trains and boats and all those types of things without then the added pressure of thinking, crikey, if my entire hearing system collapses on a plane, how am I going to pick up the pieces on the other side, and how do I get back, and what happens? And it was just like, it's a nightmare, but it's a really vicious cycle, and I don't have any of those feelings. I really don't. So yeah, a completely different person. I love flying, I love travel. I think what I needed to do was to use the idea of desensitizing. That really helped in terms of sound therapy. So I know that with some sound therapy we use the idea of masking a lot, but that's okay, but that only sorts out one equation. It doesn't sort out everything, and there's lots of different ways to use sound therapy. But for me, it was desensitization, Emily, and very positive thinking, but positive thinking that was relevant to the needs that I was living within. So, for example, I'm not going to think about when I get to the end of that journey. I'm going to try my very best to just enjoy the present moment and deal with that. And try and actually enjoy that. Pick a set of clothes that I'm comfortable with. Buy a pair of shoes that make me feel comfortable. Like be nice to myself for a change, rather than the idea of this impending doom. It's kind of really simple things, though, isn't it? It's really simple. And then when I come back, I'm going to enjoy talking about the experience with a loved one or with friends. And then I share that experience, and then I've moved on from it. And I think it's very, very different. Absolutely right. So please, if it's possible, if you could talk about in detail ACT, please, that'd be lovely.
I will. So I will preface this by saying that this therapy is relatively abstract. I'll try to break it down in an understandable way, but please interrupt me, or I'm happy to answer questions on it. So ACT is a mindfulness-based therapy. So if anyone has experience with CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy, you'll know that CBT focuses on us trying to change our thoughts. So we're kind of always wrestling with our thoughts, identifying them, trying to come up with maybe a more positive spin. ACT doesn't have us do any of that. It focuses on changing our relationship with our thoughts and therefore our relationship with our symptoms. So let me offer you an analogy that gives you a kind of an overall sense of what ACT is, and then I'll break down in specific steps. So for anyone listening, I want you to think about, or you can actually do it, putting your hands in front of your eyes. And I'm not going to do it because I want you to be able to hear me. So when you put your hands in front of your eyes, you can't see anything, right? It would be really hard to live your life and try to function if your hands were constantly over your eyes. So the analogy here is that your hands are tinnitus. When you have all of your attention focused on the tinnitus, it completely consumes your life and you're not able to do anything else. ACT has us take those hands, the tinnitus, and put them in our laps. So we're able to see what's going on around us. We're able to engage with the environment. We're still living with the tinnitus. Our hands are still there, but they don't completely consume everything about our experience. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's
okay.
Brilliant. Great analogy.
Okay. So let me break down. So ACT really focuses on the difference between pain and suffering. And pain is just that. It's kind of the direct experience we have. Say we fall and break our leg. The pain is what's associated with just that, the injury. Suffering is everything we tell ourselves about that broken leg. So let's move that to tinnitus so I can make sure it's more understandable. The pain is the tinnitus. It's the loud noise you might hear. It's just the experience of the sound. The suffering is all the language, all the extra stuff we add on top, saying, I can't handle this. My life is over. I'm not going to ever be able to travel again. I'm not going to be able to live a meaningful life. So ACT outlines 6 things that this therapy believes, or the way that they conceptualize what keeps us suffering, with the idea being that pain is unavoidable in life. Things are going to happen. We're going to lose loved ones. We might experience an illness or an injury or whatever, but suffering doesn't have to be part of our experience. So the 6 areas that ACT talks about that keep us suffering are, number 1, avoiding our experiences. And I think, Rupert, you spoke a little bit to this in the beginning, of all you could focus on were your ears. How do I get rid of this? I need to completely get rid of this. And if I don't completely get rid of it, I can't live a meaningful life. Yeah. So when we're trying to just completely avoid our experiences, it creates a tremendous amount of anxiety and depression. Because we know there is no cure for tinnitus, unfortunately. And so when we're trying to tell ourselves, I need to completely get rid of this, maybe, maybe that's not something that's going to happen. Maybe it can be put in the background and you can experience a very meaningful life otherwise. But when we're focused completely on getting rid of it, it just creates this vicious cycle that we spoke about. Number 2 is living in the past and living in the future. So this is kind of a lack of mindfulness. So living in the past might be grieving our former selves, saying, before this came on, before I experienced this tinnitus, I was able to do whatever I wanted. I had this great life and I took it for granted. And maybe there's some guilt associated with that. Or living in the future. Oh my gosh, what is my life going to look like? And that creates that tremendous amount of anxiety and fear and catastrophizing, rather than living in the present moment, which is what we were talking about, which can really help people just move step by step through the process and figure out their own healing journeys. So that's number 2. Number 3 is lacking direction or lacking a sense of values. So not knowing what's important to us, because when maybe we're stopped in our tracks because we have developed this sudden onset of tinnitus, we're completely consumed by the tinnitus and not thinking, man, I still need to engage in these things that are important to me, like engaging with family or engaging in the arts or engaging in fitness. So we can kind of lose who we are. So maintaining that compass and realizing the things that are important to us, the life we want to live, and taking steps towards still reaching those things is very important. So those are the first three. So let's kind of recap. So avoiding our experiences, living in the past, living in the future, and lacking values. So those are the first three. I know this is long, so we'll get to the last three. We can recap if we need to. Number 4 is being paralyzed by not knowing how to move forward. So instead doing nothing. And avoidance is a major issue for a lot of disorders. Tinnitus, one of them, vestibular disorders, dizziness is a major problem too. The problem is our worlds get smaller and smaller and smaller. Like you said, Rupert, like you wouldn't fly, and maybe traveling was something really important to you.
Yeah.
So it's kind of the idea of just shutting down and not knowing what to do. So we just don't do anything. And by doing that, if you want to go back to the neuroplasticity talk, that's the negative plasticity. It's sitting
Yes.
online and Googling, how am I going to fix my tinnitus, rather than engaging in things in life that are important to us. Number 5 has to do with our identity. So this might be tinnitus completely consuming your identity. So you are your tinnitus. That defines you as a person, rather than seeing, I am a person who experiences tinnitus. I am a person who can observe my tinnitus. I am a whole person with all these other traits and all these other things that define me. And then finally, the last one is called cognitive fusion. It's when we believe that our thoughts are true. So when we're telling ourselves, my life, I'm not going to be able to do the things I want. I'm never going to be able to travel. This is going to ruin my life. I can't handle this. Thoughts are just thoughts. And to me, that's an anxiety brain telling you these things that are probably not true. But a lot of times we get hooked in because these thoughts are very seducing. And we believe that these thoughts are true, and really they're just thoughts. So those are kind of the 6 realms. So if you were to see an acceptance and commitment therapist, this is the framework that they would use to help you move towards engaging in things that are important to you, and to help you kind of get unstuck and just living in service of your values is a term that they like to use. So it's really saying, okay, pain is something that I might be living with, but suffering doesn't have to be. And again, suffering is all that extra stuff that we pile on top of the pain, typically based on language and thoughts and kind of our reaction to situations. So I'll pause there. I know that was a lot to unpack. So do you have any questions or any clarifying things that you want to go over?
Yeah, loads.
Oh, good.
Well, again, I've just had another eye of the duck moment.
Oh, good.
I was only meant to have one. There's only one in a day. We've got 2. But I'd like to know, so my brain is saying and asking this question, which is a question you wrote down earlier on, and I actually now want to engage with it because it's really important, which is, so we're talking about mindfulness as it relates to ACT. So what is the science behind mindfulness and meditation? So how does the meditation work within that?
Right. So the mindfulness piece, ACT, again, is a mindfulness-based therapy. And I should have done this earlier. Let me define mindfulness for you. Yeah. It's really just engaging with the present moment, with all 5 senses, but without judgment. So it's kind of observing what's going on without, again, adding that extra layer of labeling, how we like to do with our thoughts and with language. So ACT is a mindfulness-based therapy. And the research around that is that it can help to modulate certain areas of the brain, like the amygdala, which I mentioned is associated with fear and anxiety. ACT doesn't emphasize meditation itself. So let's talk about what mindfulness is and what meditation is. Yeah. So mindfulness is what I just spoke about. It's living in the present moment without judgment. Meditation is more like setting aside a specific time to engage in a practice. So meditation typically involves some level of mindfulness. So you might be like focusing on your breath or doing a body scan or focusing on certain sensations. But mindfulness is something that you can just do in your daily life. So you might be brushing your teeth and you're going to say, okay, I'm really going to tune in to like, how does my toothbrush feel in my mouth? What am I tasting? What is the sensation like on my hand? What is the sensation like in my mouth? Whereas meditation, again, is like a specific practice. Does that make sense?
It very much does. Now,
Okay.
does that tie in with reaction and perception then? Is that how that concept amplifies into the way that we act, the way that we react to things that seem like they're really tremendously bad for us? So is that what we're learning when we're dealing with mindfulness on a very basic level and an important basic level? Are we looking at, when we're dealing with taste, sensation, feeling,
Mm-hmm.
that obviously permeates then into reaction and perception, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
That would amplify into that world, I would imagine, wouldn't it?
Yes. So when we're more engaged with the present moment, we're less likely to be living in the past or future. So sometimes, I don't know if you feel this, I've definitely felt this, like feeling like you're on autopilot. So maybe like you're driving down the road and you meant to make a right turn somewhere and you completely missed it because you're in your head thinking about like a million other things.
Yes.
That's a lack of mindfulness. That's living in the past. Maybe you're thinking about things you should have done or regrets or whatever it might be, or living in the future. What do I have? What am I going to make for dinner? What am I going to do tomorrow? What is my life going to look like in a decade? Who knows? So mindfulness brings us to that present moment. So it really helps us not engage with those thoughts that are not helpful to us, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And by practicing that present moment awareness, that's the neuroplasticity. So that's moving those pathways. It's creating new neural pathways to engage more in the present moment. So it becomes easier and easier and easier as we continue to do that, because we're telling our brain this is what's important. Whereas if we're always catastrophizing, we're always thinking about the future, that's what we're telling our brain is important. So then our fear center is going to get larger because we're telling our brain this fear and anxiety is really important. Does that make sense? And I can talk about meditation also and how that impacts the brain. I came across some really interesting studies.
It makes perfect sense. It makes absolute sense. Yes, please carry on, Emily. If you'd like to discuss the meditation and the
sure. Let's do it. So so meditation, again, it is also an evidence-based practice. So we have a lot of research to show its benefits. And I actually found a study about meditation specifically for tinnitus, and it actually performed superior to relaxation training alone, which is interesting. But in terms of general benefits of meditation, it can help us thicken the prefrontal cortex, which is in the frontal lobe of our brains right here, which is in charge of higher order functioning. It's kind of like what sets us apart from animals. So it's functions like concentration, decision-making, organizing, planning. And in fact, I came across another similar study that showed that people age 40 to 50 who engage in meditation consistently have similar gray matter to a 20 to 30-year-old. So all of this information is telling us about the positive impact that it can have on the brain. And then, like I mentioned, meditation specifically for tinnitus has shown positive benefits as well.
Superb. Is there, I know the archetypal kind of position for meditation is lying comfortably or sitting comfortably.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't have done that in the early days. Everything for me was go, 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 because I was, with such bad tinnitus, I found it very, very hard during the day to sort of sit still. I found that excruciating. So I used to like listening to meditation as I was walking, not running. I never listened to anything. I just used to like the sound of the beat of the running. That was what I was really into. I loved engaging the rhythm of running. But is walking and listening to meditation, is that okay to start with? Is that all right?
It's completely all right. And I've people ask me this question all the time, like, what is the right amount of meditation? And I don't think that there's a right answer for that. I think if you look at one study or you look at a second study, they're not going to be consistent. One study might have had people trying a meditation for 5 minutes and another might have been for 20 minutes. I think it's all about what works for you. And I think if you're in a state of what we'd say like sympathetic arousal, or like where you feel like you're on edge and you've got to be moving, walking is perfectly fine. And in fact, it's something that I've talked to my own patients about, taking a mindful walk. So what that might look like is you're walking down the street, instead of being in your head, instead of catastrophizing and thinking about what is my life going to look like in 10 years, notice a specific tree. Notice the branches, notice the leaves, notice any specific colors you might see. How do your feet feel as they're walking on the ground? Do you notice any specific scents? Are there like flowers in the air that you might smell? How does the cold air feel on your skin? So that's a very actually novel idea for a lot of people. And I think you'll find that if you're engaging with your five senses like that, you'll notice things around you that you've never noticed before. And you might be in an environment that you lived in for decades. But because we just get so in our heads all the time, a technique like what I described, it's kind of like a grounding technique where you're focusing on your five senses, can really be profound for people. Or like you mentioned, Rupert, if you want to listen to something that's more of a guided type meditation, that can be helpful as well. Because when you're in the beginning of your journey and your mind is racing, it can be really hard to even concentrate on anything. So I think just getting into the rhythm of trying to listen to a guided meditation can be really helpful. And you'll find if you do it consistently, it will get easier and easier. You'll be able to calm your mind more quickly. At least that's been my personal experience and the experience of other people that I've worked with.
That's brilliant. That's an absolutely brilliant answer. So I've got another question regarding the meditation. So
Sure.
Where it's kind of leading is something that I do now, which would be, although I record and I make guided meditations, I don't write the scripts. We ask this wonderful person, Jordan, and we have Severin and all different types of people, Angela and Mia, to do our meditations. But the meditations that I probably do myself and practice are just literally walking and listening every day to the sounds that are enveloped in the natural environment. So I'm lucky enough to live in a town. So I quite like the town sounds. I don't like really loud motorbikes, but I like the hustle and bustle. That's deliberately why I moved to a town, particularly with tinnitus, as I want that feeling of noise, but it's not horrible. But then my becomes really interesting quite quickly. So I'm down the high street, and now I'm moving towards the sea. So it's very visual. There are hovercrafts, which are very unusual. There's a passenger ferry, there's a bus. I'm right on the sea now, and then I've got the sound of the sea lapping. I've got the sound of people drinking and clunking coffee glasses. I guess what I'm saying is that because I'm now fully aware of that environment and that existence, it changes every day, because I know every day is different. And actually, every person seems to be different every day of that trip as well. It feels like it is a brand new journey every time. So what I guess I'm saying in a roundabout way is that a meditation? For me, it's very relaxing, and it's brilliant. And I do it for about an hour and a half most mornings, every morning, in fact. I'm not being guided, but in a sense, I'm being guided by nature and by my environment. Is that still meditation?
It is. It is. So I think of meditation as going into some sort of practice with an intention, like you just mentioned, with the intention maybe to be noticing your five senses, or engaging with the environment around you. And meditation, I think one myth or misconception about meditation is that it has to be guided. I know plenty of people who engage in meditation just in silence, and maybe even just sitting alone in a room, because like you mentioned, how like the clinking of the coffee glasses or the sound of the ocean or whatever it is, meditation, mindfulness allows you to engage in or experience things as new, which can be very exciting and can even unlock sort of emotions that maybe you haven't experienced before or in a long time. So even if you're just sitting with your body and you're not listening to a guided meditation per se, if you're just noticing what's going on in your body, our bodies are changing every day too. So yes, it's just engaging in some sort of intentional practice. It doesn't have to be guided. It can definitely be silent. I think it's whatever feels meaningful for you and for whatever allows you to engage in the present moment most fully.
That's fantastic. Would you say also that, for example, if you're if we're talking about, it's very different, but again, it kind of plays into this. We're talking about, say, diet. So what is really a good thing to do is to eat within the seasons. So you're eating your root crops in the winter, your brilliant potatoes, things that are coming out of the ground. In the summer, it changes. So maybe it's the tomatoes, the strawberries, the fruit. So is it the same thing that it is really important, even if we're at the height of our troubles with tinnitus, that we still live within the season, so we recognize every aspect of that? Because I guess what you're saying is that's still incredibly positive, even if we might be struggling and suffering a little bit. The idea, it's still very purposeful, because you are still, there's still this little percentage of fulfillment of the idea that you're living properly within that world, that you're that natural world. So I know that I'm bringing this up because I know it really helped me. It allowed me to really get some sort of grounding and get rooted first. And I found that was really important, the idea that I would then, although, you're saying about not looking too much in the future, but I love the season. So I would think, well, summer's fantastic, but I look forward to the autumn and what that might bring. So is that important also, Emily, the idea that we do live fully within those seasons and recognize it?
I think that's an interesting point. And I think certain people can engage in that more. Like for you, it sounds like seasons are very meaningful for you. I live in Southern California, so seasons are kind of summer year round. So I think people can engage in that to differing degrees, but definitely if that's something that feels meaningful and something you want to look forward to. I think everything in life is about rhythms and patterns and cycles. Even like for women, in your menstrual cycle, hormones play differently at different times. And so maybe your body...
I'm going to ask you about that, Emily. Yes, please. Thank you.
Yeah. So maybe your body is asking for something certain at a certain time, maybe like when your estrogen is higher, maybe you feel like that need to go jogging or running or be more active. And then maybe when progesterone is higher towards the end of the cycle, that's kind of like relaxation type hormone. Maybe you might want to engage in a meditation that's more lying down or sitting. So I think it's really all about listening to what your body wants and kind of honoring that and recognizing that life is a series of patterns and cycles.
That's fantastic. I've got a completely different question,
Sure.
but it's one that I really want to ask everybody that is our special guest on the T- webinar. And it's this. What would you tell somebody, Emily, who has been newly diagnosed with tinnitus?
I would say that I know you're probably feeling very overwhelmed. I know it probably feels like your world has been turned upside down, and to a degree, maybe it has. But like I mentioned in talking about acceptance and commitment therapy, try to stay in the present moment. Try not to get super ahead of yourself, because treatment is really a step-by-step process. It might look different for everyone. Unfortunately, it can really require time and patience and trialing different things, different behavioral health things, different medical things. There are professionals that want to help you and that are able to help you. So I would just encourage you, while you're on this journey and you're walking it down the road step by step, to engage in self-care, to take care of yourself, and to not lose sight of the things that are important to you. Because we know that living in service of those values, living in service of things that make you feel like you have a meaningful and purposeful life are very important. So that's kind of my take on it. Rupert, did you have anything specific to add about your experience?
Yeah, I mean, yours is fantastic. Mine was very different, very practical. It was really to steer clear of the wrong information. I think this is why I want to work and collaborate with people like yourself, because I really realized through making mistakes early on that the right clinical information is vital. I didn't have necessarily bad clinical information at all. I just couldn't get hold of it. It was very difficult to get hold of it. There were huge long waiting lists 30 years ago, and there was very there wasn't a lot of information, but the information that was around was misleading and not very helpful. So certainly now when you've got forums and groups that are fairly negative, it's not always the case. There's some amazing groups out there that are really helpful, but yeah, there's a lot of fear mongering and gloom and doom, and it can be very worrying. So I would say anybody that's newly diagnosed, I would obviously echo what you were saying. I think absolutely, but really steer clear if you can of the kind of negative connotations of forums.
I can definitely second that. And as a patient myself, I've deeply felt that going in these groups and feeling like, oh my gosh, these people say that they haven't felt better in 20 years or whatever it might be. And I think, at least for me personally, the groups were helpful for getting specific clinical information, like you mentioned, like they might reference specific academic journal articles. For me, it was helpful to hear about people's experience with specific doctors. And then I reached out via private message to another woman who had a similar story to mine, and we became friends outside of the group. But beyond that, after I got kind of what I needed, I sort of separated myself from the group because I found it to be extremely anxiety provoking. Yeah. And the thing about the groups is that people have a plethora of things going on. They might have other medical conditions that you don't know about. You don't know about their access to care. You don't know how motivated they are to seek care. So it's kind of, it gives you, like you said, this can give you this doom and gloom picture. And you really, everyone's experience is unique, and you really can't say, oh my gosh, my experience is going to look the same as all of these people. So I think that groups can be helpful in some regards, but they can also be detrimental in others. So I would say to proceed with caution.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It was very difficult, and I'm not blaming anybody. It was just very little information. So I was sent to by the doctor many years ago. I was sent to this anxiety group, and with a box of diazepam to go with it, and really know what that was or what it was doing. And I experimented with it for, I think I had 5 tablets of these over a period of about a week and a half. And I very quickly realized that this is not the way I wanted to go, because it did buy me probably half an hour of time away from it, but it wasn't something that I wanted to disappear from. It's quite easy to do that. That's what I felt for myself anyway. So I've kept the packet still in the loft. I still have it as a reference because it was, I didn't use all of it, but I still have it there, not to use, but it's just a memory that I wanted to keep as a way of just saying that you've come a long way from this situation. Not to say that people find it really useful, as well. It may be that it's essential. So, I'm not saying it was only for me that it didn't work for me,
right?
But
right.
It was, to be taken to an anxiety group, which was actually, it was pretty flipping phenomenal going there, because the people were so interesting, but it wasn't what I needed. I wasn't suffering from per se anxiety. It was a very simple byproduct of the tinnitus. And this is that thing that I'm obsessed with at the moment, which is the idea of coining the phrase the tinnitus maze, because you're without permission and unwillingly dropped in it, but nobody tells you how to get out of it, because there's loads of dead ends in this maze. It's like you can go up one street and then there's absolutely for 2 years. So I might have had a spike in the early days that lasted literally 2 years, but I didn't know how to get out of it. So now if I have a spike, it doesn't last, or I don't even think of it as a spike, because I don't even want to call it a spike. It's like, I'm not trying to break the rules, but I just don't see it as that. It's just an elevated case of tinnitus, but it goes away. It pops back in as quickly as it came out, because I don't give it any attention. So I guess what I'm saying is there wasn't an exit strategy, because nobody knew much about tinnitus and its associated problems and confusion. But I feel very much as if that, you could create now this world in which you can allow people to really understand how the maze works. And for us, and what I'm working on, is the idea that you build in a proper exit strategy. So you don't ever go back in that maze again. You might have tinnitus forever, but it's not going to be problematic in the same way that it was before. You're not going to be exasperated by it. And all the things you're saying, it's not going to ruin your life in any way. I mean, my tinnitus my relationship with it is a completely different thing now. It's I use it as a way to express myself. I'm not saying I love it and I would not want it, but it's okay. I'm completely okay with it. And like I say, I'll express myself and use it as a channel for something else. So it's meant that I'm able to understand sound therapy maybe a lot deeper, because I've experienced a lot of those sounds that people have had. I've had multiple tinnitus sounds and all sorts of problems related to tinnitus and hypersensitivity. So maybe the gift that I was given, I see it pretty much as a gift, is that I'm able to see the tinnitus in a different way. So if I look at it in a completely different way, I'm not judging it like I used to. It's not absolutely consuming me, exactly what you're talking about. So I think that's really, really important. And so, yeah, I would say, yeah, I mean, I just wish I'd have known more. The anxiety group was great because they were lovely people and they all had amazing stories that brought them. We all were brought to this room for reasons really nothing to do with anxiety. They were just flip moments where something happened in their lives and their lives just changed and they couldn't find a way through it. So we all ended up in this group, but we ended up becoming friends, a lot of us, and so interesting. But it wasn't what I necessarily needed. It was just an interesting, wonderful bunch of people. But I definitely wouldn't subscribe to a group like that. Essentially, when you're newly diagnosed with tinnitus, you really need like you're saying, somebody like yourself or a hearing therapist or wonderful, clean, trustworthy information. That's you can get a lot of relief from. That's what was the turning point for me, was that I was given really good, trusted information. So we've got another question. Just a couple more, if that's okay, Emily.
Sure,
sure. I know that you're really busy. What's the time where you are in California?
It's 11:30 a.m.
Oh, crikey. Yeah. Okay. So when we have a tinnitus spike, this is a question that's just come in, and anxiety is very high as a result. What steps can we take to break the worry loop? I know we've touched on this in earlier on.
So this, I think it's kind of twofold. I think that the anxiety spike can be physiological. So you might feel kind of that heart racing, maybe sweaty, kind of just internally restless. For that, I would focus on nervous system calming techniques. So that might be things like meditation, diaphragmatic breathing, body scans. Progressive muscle relaxation is another really good one. So that's kind of getting us into our body and trying to calm things more from a physiological perspective. And then there's the cognitive perspective of the kind of racing thoughts. And the things that can be helpful there would be things like from cognitive behavioral therapy techniques or ACT techniques. And that's the tough thing, is like you really need someone to teach you those things, because they're not very intuitive, but you might engage in some sort of distraction. So if you want to couple like a meditation with a guided visualization type thing to sort of get you out of that loop, you really want to try to get your mind out of that loop. So that might be like a guided meditation with visualization, for example. It might be some sort of mantra that you tell yourself, like, I've been through this before, I'm going to get through this again. I've been through this before, I'm going to get through this again. It might be talking to a trusted social support person. So it's really, again, addressing it from the physiological sort of body arousal perspective, and then also the cognitive piece, which can be helpful with specific techniques or also distraction type techniques.
That's absolutely fantastic. Yeah, that's a great answer. And finally, with the situation we're in and what's happened, have you noticed any adverse effects from either COVID or from the vaccination on the vestibular system? Are you helping people through that? I noticed that with our groups, we have people on all sides of the fence that, there's how do we help steer those people forward and clear of these associated problems?
It's honestly such a tough situation. Yes, I have seen people come to me and say my symptoms started after I got either COVID or the COVID vaccine. And so we know that COVID, the virus itself, mounts an immune response, but then the vaccine also mounts an immune response, and that immune response has to do with inflammation. And so if you're predisposed in some way towards any neurological type issue or an ear related issue, it can be kind of the thing that sets you off into having that. And so it's such a tough thing, because some people are saying, I'm so worried about getting the vaccine. I personally was worried about it because I didn't know how my body would react. But then it's trying to weigh that, like in a controlled environment. Okay, I'm going to choose to get this, and maybe I'll have a few days to rest, versus trying to avoid getting the virus itself, which is so difficult with these different strains. And then it seems like they're becoming more and more contagious. So it's kind of like, people are in this situation where they don't know what to do. So I personally talked to my doctor about it. I talked about like which vaccine specifically, since we have 3 that we can choose from here. I don't know what it's like in the UK, about which ones he had seen the most sort of adverse reactions to. And so he helped me decide which of the vaccines to get. And then like before I got the vaccine, I made sure to hydrate and kind of take care of myself and exercise, so my body would be in the best position to accept it. I wish I had a better answer for you, but yes, I've seen some people come to me and say my symptoms started either from the virus itself or from the vaccine. And so it's just really a tough situation to be in, I think.
It's really interesting what you're saying. That overall situation comes out more and more, which is inflammation. No matter what has caused it, that seems to be such a massive issue, is inflammation, particularly with things like with tinnitus. Even after a really heavy cold or something like that, I noticed that in the early days that would always go to my hearing system. So what do we do? Is there anything, as a last thing, is there anything that we can do about things like inflammation? For example, what can we do naturally that will really help us, that we have in everyday life? So for example, is it water? Do we intake and ingest much more water than we would normally do? I mean, what would you recommend?
Yeah, I think obviously staying hydrated is really important. I think that there's research on certain supplements, and again, this is not medical advice. I'm just saying what the research shows. There's some research on like omega-3 fatty acids that can be helpful with inflammation. There's some research on turmeric. The active ingredient in turmeric is curcumin. So you could talk to your doctor about various medications or natural supplements that you can use, but also something that people don't think about is our thoughts themselves impact our immune system. So when we're in a constant state of fight or flight, when we're having this pattern of the catastrophic thinking, we're telling our bodies there's danger. And when we're telling our bodies there's danger, they don't know if that danger is real or if it's perceived. And so when we're telling our bodies there's danger, that activates the immune system and it creates inflammation. So I know it can be sort of a catch-22. It's like, well, I don't want to stress. And then if I am stressed, then I'm stressed about being stressed because I know I shouldn't be stressed. But the general take-home note is that people like to think about how can I address inflammation with medication or some easy fix, when really behavioral techniques, like we're talking about the mindfulness, like we're talking about relaxation strategies or CBT or ACT, actually have a tangible impact on inflammation. So it's all interrelated, and kind of the behavioral piece is my area of expertise. But we know that stress contributes to problems with all bodily systems. So if you can really try to get a hold of that stress and learn some stress management techniques, that can really help in the realm of inflammation.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thanks for being an amazing guest on our T- webinar. Thank you very much, Dr. Emily. Fantastic. Is there a kind of link that you could give people to? We will put that out as well on our socials, but if people would like to get in touch with you, how could they do that, please, Emily?
So my website is rootedbehavioraleducation.com, and it's behavioral spelled the American way without the U. So BEHAVIORAL You can email me at info@rootedbehavioraleducation.com. And I'm also on Instagram and on Facebook at rootedbehavioraleducation.com. I'm pretty good about keeping up with messages and people commenting on any posts or anything. So I'm happy to connect with anyone.
Thank you so much. That's absolutely amazing, Emily. Thank you ever so much. And what we're going to try and do, everybody, is that if you want to get in touch, we're going to do a webinar on Tinnitus Awareness Week that's coming up soon. And we're going to try and have 2 special guests for that week. Somebody within the workplace, the music business, and also somebody that is running a company that deals with noise exposure. So you can find us on www.t-minus.info, our email, on Instagram, Tinnitus Minus, on Twitter, Facebook group, which is T-minus, Tinnitus Wellness Support Group, and you can find us on LinkedIn. And importantly, if you're looking for instant sound therapy, you can find us on the Apple Store as T-minus Tinnitus Wellness app. Thanks ever so much, Emily, and all the very best to you. Take care of yourself.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
Bye-bye, Emily. Bye.